This podcast is brought to you by the Prospect Research Institute, where researchers come to learn, innovate, and connect.
Frankly, if organizations aren't ready to employ machine learning yet because they just don't have enough data, then they should be really focused on an aggressive strategic path to collecting data.
Welcome to Prospect Research Chat Bites, a podcast by and for prospect research professionals. I'm Jennifer Filla. Today, I'm talking with Nathan Chappell, president at Futurus Group. Hello, Nathan. Thank you for joining me today on Chat Bites.
Thanks for having me. It's really a pleasure.
Before we jump into the topic of the Futurus Group gratitude score and what all that means, I'm wondering if you would be willing to share a little bit about your career, because I'm thinking you didn't start out in data science. Will you share a little bit?
Yeah, of course. Yeah, no, in fact, I've been in nonprofit for about 18 years, but I started out really more on the business operational side. So my undergrad is business marketing, really always had more of a stronger focus on economics. But prior to being in the nonprofit sector, I started and sold two tech companies. One was a .com in 96, 97, which is still around today, and the other was a digital scanning company. But always been early adopter in technology, but not really necessarily in the data science side. So it's been a really interesting progression of my career throughout the last 15 to 20 years.
So you have been in tech or technology. That's interesting.
Yeah, to be honest, I always felt a little bit like a fish out of water being in the nonprofit sector because I'm much more operationally focused. I always thought that we're in a fundraising shop. Either if I was a fundraiser, I equated it to sales, which was not a popular thing. It's become a little more acceptable. Or in fundraising management, really looking at ROI and activities and moves and all those combinations of things that would help a nonprofit be successful or not. I mean, those are all standard business principles. So there's a piece of me that I've never let go of, that for the last, the majority of my career in the nonprofit sector has been a bit more focused on analytics and metrics and the different things that we could do as organizations to be more effective or more efficient. And that was fairly rare for a while. Now you're starting to see more and more professionals that are starting in graduate school wanting to be in fundraising. But back when I got my second master's in nonprofit management, there were only a few programs in the country, and now there's hundreds. So I think you're starting to see a different level of professionalism in our field from a business perspective kind of coming in. But now today, of course, machine learning, data science, analytics, whatever, form of data intelligence that you're focused on is really what the differentiator is for most businesses. And so you're seeing a lot more of that being infused into the nonprofit sector.
Okay, so you're stepping up the game again, and you're looking more towards this machine learning, artificial intelligence. Can you give us your elevator speech on what the gratitude score is?
Yeah, I mean, the elevator speech is actually pretty easy. We developed this algorithm in machine learning using deep learning that is able to help us predict who's most likely to make a donation without using wealth data. And so it's a pretty revolutionary approach to a field that's been around for a long time, but it's basically a new way of thinking in the nonprofit sector.
I would say so, for sure. Yeah, wealth screenings are coming up against their limits in terms of, productivity in fundraising.
Yeah, I mean, and this is my realization, leading nonprofit organizations and leading fundraising teams, is that we were having marginal success. We either were building models or we were using wealth data to find people to put in portfolios. And I was sitting down with David Lawson at APRA a few weeks ago, and it was just this great analogy that he just so easily points out, is that pre-wealth screening philanthropy was almost entirely relational. You didn't know, necessarily how wealthy someone was until you got to know them. So the field was entirely relational. It was about getting to know people and building those relationships. And wealth screening came on, and while it's an incredible tool and it's extremely valuable, and I can talk about that more later, it's not the best predictor to help you determine who's most likely to give. It's a great indicator to tell you how much, But what's happened over the last 40 years is that organizations, in probably lack of having better tools, have been using wealth screening as the primary method that they would seed portfolios, that they would identify prospects and put them in. And we realized this years ago, that when we were testing wealth screening against who was actually making donations in our organization, we found out that the wealth screening was only predicting who would make a donation around 10% of the time. And so that's what really was kind of the epiphany moment for me and our team, that we just thought there's got to be a better way. Now, with that said, it's a two-sided coin. We have an algorithm that's extremely good at identifying who is most likely to give without their wealth, but we also still need the wealth screening to help inform organizations on how much that person's likely to give.
It's still important. It's just secondary.
Exactly.
You have been out there interviewing and talking about your new product. And in one of those interviews I heard, you talked about the importance of a living, growing model versus the static models we use today. And I'm thinking of some of those predictive giving scores. Can you talk to me a little bit, or explain a little bit what you mean by that living, growing model?
Yeah, absolutely. So there's really two main distinctions between, say, machine learning, quote unquote AI, which is just a very general, broad term, but machine learning, and traditional regression algorithms, or just traditional algorithms. Machine learning is an algorithm itself. But one of the key differences is that a traditional algorithm that's developed in R or whatever statistical software you're going to use actually performs worse with more data that it gets. It gets to a point where after 18 or 24 variables, the model actually will decline in its efficacy, in how well it's performing. So that's probably one of the biggest differences. And so with machine learning, it uses unlimited amounts of data. In fact, the results get better with more granular data that you can provide. And with that, you're actually removing a lot of bias out of the data, because a lot of it is by only including 18 or 24 variables, you're actually biasing your data tremendously by omitting a lot of data. With deep learning, you don't have to worry about that. But the other biggest part that I think was also the epiphany for us when we started developing this machine learning model. I remember one day, after about 6 months going through this process, realizing that I would never have to buy another model, because a machine learning model actually gets better over time. So what happens in a traditional regression model is that it's like a balance sheet that you're looking at in accounting. It was developed for a day in time. It will tell you the very best results it can on the day it was run. But by nature, every day after that, the model actually will perform worse and worse and worse every single day, because your data in your organization is changing every day. But that model that you ran on whatever particular day you ran it will never change. So this living, growing model, which generally, I guess we just call it dynamic versus static, but this dynamic model actually gets better over time. And so what it's able to do, using all the big data, it can actually look back at, say, yesterday or last week or last month and say, well, there's a lot more people now that either made a donation or they didn't make a donation, or people that were more engaged or less engaged. And it's able to re-rank the entire constituent database based on the data that just happened the day before or the week before. And that's really the living, growing part of it, which is so exciting. When we started the first model that we built, I think the first run after going through the deep learning process before it was trained was about 16% accurate in determining who was most likely to make a gift. And by the time we continued to train the model, and as it learned more of the traits that donors and non-donors had in common, donors that have things in common with other donors and non-donors have things in common with other non-donors, that the model actually got to a point where it was about 50% accurate. And the great thing is you can test this very easily, because all you do is point it to last year's data and all of your constituents for last year, but you don't tell the machine who made donations of all those constituents. And when the machine can do with about 50% accuracy, it's called recall in machine learning, that's 50%, 50, of recall, where it says, I know who made a donation last year because of all my intelligence about everything that I've learned of all your donors over the last 10 years, then you know the machine is ready to go out into the world. But from there on, as organizations feed it more data, and there's examples of this in the private sector, where private sector companies have been using machine learning for 10 years, feeding it data every day, feeding it data, retraining the model. you can get to 80, 90% accuracy in some of these models. So it's a really exciting thing for organizations to invest in, because it truly is an investment that you will continue to grow and get better over time.
That is a great explanation. And that's a huge change. I didn't realize the limitations of those regression models. I knew that they were static, that they were a point in time, but I didn't realize there was a limitation on the number of variables, which is interesting. You can continually grow how effective your model is at predicting. That's wild.
Yeah, exactly. The thing that's really exciting about it is that organizations can get also creative about the types of data. So right now, your model, we can build a model in almost every situation that will perform 50% accuracy. But if organizations get creative and either develop new data sets, where it's either they develop a survey and now they have this new data set, or they find in an organization that there's other data sets that speak to a person's experience, you can then include that data and basically amend the model to get better and better over time. And you don't have to worry about it in the same way, where when you're only selecting 18 or 24 variables, you have to run regressions to make sure those are the 18 or 24 variables. So you've got to be really, really sure. Well, machine learning, it doesn't matter, because you can load thousands of variables and the machine will tell you statistically how relevant that field or that data point is to the model itself. And it doesn't have to be yes or no. It's just on the scale of basically 0 to 1 on how important that attribute is affecting the overall model. So most of our models now use over 1,000, basically the hot vectors, but they use, one of our big clients uses 1,000 in their model. Another one is up to about 4,000 features per constituent in a patient setting, per patient, per constituent, and it runs the entire database on those several thousand features.
Well, that's a wonderful segue right into what I really, really want to ask you about, and that is the data. There's 3 areas of the data that I'm hoping we can cover. The first is the role of external data in your models. So we talked a little bit about well screening. I want to talk about the under data served, and then also how we might communicate, or how people are communicating this kind of data use to their donors. So let's jump in with the role of external data. What kinds of external data are important for identifying gratitude? And are you using things like social media data?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. So I think there's 2 different definitions of external data, and from the philanthropic lens. So from a philanthropy office, typically external data would be things most people would consider outside your CRM. And so in our case, as we broke into this field in healthcare, external data to the philanthropy office is actually electronic medical record, patient satisfaction surveys, information from donor search and some well screening, some of that. It's a different way of thinking. So if you think about it in a university setting, there would be the fundraising office would have its own CRM data. But if you were able to collect data on the number of parking tickets that a student had while they were in school, the types of grades that they had, scholarships, awards, the distance they lived from campus, all of these disparate data sets that would have been considered external years ago are now so valuable in a setting where you're using like lots and lots of data to build a really more holistic model. In terms of social media, we have not used it yet, but we're having several conversations. It seems to be the buzzword. It seems to be what every fundraising organization is talking about. But the challenge with social media data and the fallacy with it still is that the match rate is extremely low, because people don't typically use their real email addresses when they're engaging socially online, and it's very expensive. I do think there's huge value in it in the future. I do think it's a different way of thinking. Data is the fuel that keeps the engine going, and it's an opportunity to get very creative about any kind of digital exhaust that a person is leaving in how they interact in an organization is the data that you can capture to really help inform a model.
Well, that's kind of fun. I never thought of it as digital exhaust before, but I'm going to have to quote you on that. What about the data underserved? And really, I'm thinking of 2 different things when I use that kind of term. I'm thinking about organizations that just don't have a lot of data collected. They have their giving data, but not a lot else available. And then also, I'm thinking about individuals who don't have a lot of data. So, for example, when I look for major gift prospects, I could easily be overlooking some great prospects because they don't have all the data points that I get all warm and fuzzy over or excited about. How does your machine learning, your gratitude score navigate in data scarce scenarios like that?
Yeah, no, that's a fantastic question. I get that question a lot as I speak to different levels of organizations. So of course, the larger organizations, they have the team and they have lots of data that they're able to pull together. Usually when I speak to like a local AFP, there's a lot of the question of someone will raise their hand and say like, this all sounds great, but what about me? The reality is data is everything in machine learning and in our future, kind of in how we operate in businesses in almost any sector. But it's really on a scale of results. So in a setting where you have lots of data and disparate data sources that basically speak to a person's engagement or their resonance with an organization, you can hit, we typically range about 4 to 5 times predictability from what just typical well screening would be. But for a smaller organization that basically just has its CRM information, you're kind of stuck with looking at your typical like RFM or your P2G score. Now, the difference with this is that you can still take a traditional RFM or a P2G score and put it into a machine learning model, knowing that it will get better over time. So the advantage, while it might be that you get the same results initially, there are opportunities for that model to continue to learn as you're using it. But I think this is a huge wake-up call for organizations right now. In fact, I was just with a very large academic medical center a few weeks ago, and the head of prospect development was saying, the reality is like we know that data is important in the future, and we don't even know what we're going to use it for, but we're on this like really aggressive path to collect as much data as we can. And I think that's where, frankly, if organizations aren't ready to employ machine learning yet because they just don't have enough data, then they should be really focused on, an aggressive strategic path to collecting data. To get any decent model, you need about 10,000 records. Of course, the more records you have, the better the machine can learn and the better your results will be. But small organizations that have 10,000 records could get a decent score, knowing that it's an investment in time and that you'll continue to amend those models. Then there's also external data sets that, is fairly helpful. And Donor Search has the largest data set of charitable giving of any of the well screening companies. And so we're in fact testing several of the kind of general non-wealth public data sets that are out there with Donor Search and building basically a national model that could be deployed to small nonprofits. It won't be the same 4 to 5x results, but it might be 2 to 3x. And for a small nonprofit that really doesn't have a lot of resources, it's pretty plug and play, and it's definitely going to help them become more efficient.
I had no idea. That's a really cool approach. I love it. I'm glad I asked. Last question for you is about communicating this use of data to donors. Because when I hear you talk about all the data we could collect at various types of organizations and institutions, as someone whose data it is, it makes me a little nervous, especially, healthcare. It's pretty sensitive data. But even as a student at a university, you talked about various degrees of information. Do you have clients who have crafted these statements, or do you have suggestions about how that might be communicated to donors?
Yeah, I have a lot of thoughts. And in fact, I had a conversation with a professional in our industry that I really respect yesterday about this topic. And in thinking about where we're at today and where we're going to be in the next few years, there is going to have to be a concerted effort for the nonprofit sector to disclose or to approach how we're doing what we're doing in a much more transparent, ethical way. And if you look at GDPR and everything that's happened in the UK, we're having conversations there. And many nonprofits in the UK lost 50% of their constituents overnight. Now, we don't, of course, no one wants that to happen in the United States. And what it's going to take is really the responsible use and transparency and accountability of that data. Now, there's a couple things that are different. Is that one is even with Facebook and Cambridge Analytica and everything that happened there, And the fact that with GDPR, organizations have to tell people they're using cookies, it really hasn't changed surfing habits or how people are engaging. People now are fairly used to the fact that organizations, no matter whether it's your phone or anywhere else, that data is being collected on you, but we don't want to get in the situation where that data is being misused. And so in healthcare specifically, it's probably one of the most regulated industries out there, other than those that are running credit scores and things like that. But healthcare, highly, highly regulated. But those patients are actually given an opportunity to opt out when they register in a hospital, and they're required to do that by law. So there is in healthcare a lot of regulations. I think the risk is when you're starting to use data in organizations and that where people aren't aware that you're collecting that data and using it to help make decisions. I don't have a great answer for you, except to say that it's extremely important, and organizations really need to take a careful approach to how they're disclosing information they're using and for what purpose.
Great. Well, I'm glad to hear that it's on your mind, for sure. It's definitely been on my mind. I think you're right. There's no easy answer for any organization because each organization is different and has different constituencies, but it's something we should talk about.
Right. This is a pivotal moment in the nonprofit sector. The pace that business is growing in the private sector is just exponential. The nonprofit sector has to continue to stay relevant and compete, but not at all costs. We have to be held to a higher standard. We're in a relationship business, and AI is just a tool to help you build relationships. I do think that there's a time coming in the near future where organizations have to just explicitly come out and say, this is how we know that you might be interested, and maybe we're wrong, but we hope we're not, and really use that as this opportunity to connect with the right people.
Well, thank you so much for sharing about your work and your thoughts on the field after all these years. It was really helpful. I appreciate it.
Thank you so much for having me. It's really been a pleasure.
That was Nathan Chappell, president at Futurus Group. Are you as excited as I am about a gratitude score that performs better as time goes by and more data accumulates? It's groundbreaking, and it also reminds us all that the future of analytics is here, right now. Are you ready? Do you have the right skill sets? At the Prospect Research Institute, we have courses that can help you get analytical, even if you never did take a statistics course. Learn more about our foundations in fundraising analytics and our approach to prospecting courses by visiting us at www.prospectresearchinstitute.org. I hope to see you soon in the classroom.